Since 1785, the Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond.
Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed.
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
Listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker or via our app.
A mighty hello and welcome to this co-production by The Times and the Sunday Times Cheltenham Literary Festival and Melbourne Writers Festival. My name is Beejay Silcox. I'm a writer and a critic based in Canberra, and I'll be talking today to the magnificent Helen Garner, who's joining me online from her home in Melbourne. Our discussion is part of a 5-episode series exploring the careers of major world writers to celebrate Cheltenham's Read the World Festival theme. Now, I'd hoped to be in the same room as Helen today, but as Australia grapples with the Delta variant and all its viral tenacity, we're both mired in a months-long lockdown, which is only to say we're both pathologically under-socialised, years overdue for a haircut, and have lost all sense of time as a linear projection. Also, all the questions I prepared for Helen today seem to be sort of desperately existential, but if anyone can help me solve the mysteries of the universe, or at least call bullshit on the whole endeavour, it is Helen Garner. Now, one of the many lessons I've learned from reading Helen is to lose the bullshit preamble, so I'll try and keep it short. Helen Garner has been called many things, but the label that threatens to stick is as Australia's greatest living writer. She is a writer who rouses hyperbole, which is a mighty irony as she barely touches the stuff. Helen's work has a rare and unadorned honesty, and a rare and unadorned empathy, and a gleeful wit. In her fiction, Helen crafts tales unencumbered by the weight of moral judgment that leave room for the whole grand human mess. In her non-fiction, she's drawn to acts of violence that tie knots in our collective soul. Parents who drown their children, lovers who extinguish their loves, the ever-fractious collision of sex and power. What does it take to understand such acts? Is it possible or necessary or impossibly necessary? What might we do with the enormity of our grief, the enormity of our fury? What place is there for retribution and forgiveness? What place for remembering? And how might we think about ourselves in the midst of it all? Our own frailties, our own rusted-on certainties, and our own lurking fears, our own dark desire for judgment. This is discomforting, agitating, cage-rattling work, and it's deeply humane. And now in her perhaps most audacious and gratifying project to date, Helen is publishing her diaries. The last of a trio of volumes will be published in November. Collectively, they show a writer in motion, a woman shape-shifting to fulfill others' desires and then stretching out into her own. It's a tale of mastery, its voluptuous sensualities and self-castigations. These volumes are generous and wrenching, and they're f***ing funny. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce today Helen Garner.
Hi, Beejay.
Helen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Helen, I came to your book so late. In my 30s, in fact, far too late. And the friend who first insisted that I read you, who pressed a copy of this book into my hands, said, "She's the only person I've ever read who gave me permission to disagree with her." Why is that a grand compliment?
It certainly is. It's the most wonderful one that I can remember having. I actually, funny you should mention it, because just last week I got a letter from a woman I didn't know, and she said she'd just read that book, The First Stone, and she said something like, "I felt that you were asking me to think with you, that you weren't just laying down the law, and that you were inviting me to come into the questions that the book asks." And that to me, that just filled me with joy, because I really don't like myself reading books that are laying down the law on things that are so painful that I can hardly pick them apart. And because that book, The First Stone, got me into a hell of a lot of trouble. I mean, this is 20 plus years ago now, and I got such a roasting for it, which I've recovered from. But it was very painful to me because the things that the book was about, which was, as called, the subtitle of it is Questions About Sex and Power. They were terribly important to me, and they seemed to me important to every woman and man, but particularly women that I knew in my life. And I was sort of appalled at the rage that the book provoked in particularly young feminists and university feminists. So it was a tremendous stoush, the whole thing, and it took me quite a while to get over it. But so the idea that somebody would read my work and disagree with it and not have to hate me and not feel themselves to be hated by me, that was the thing that shocked me the most about The First Stone, was that if you disagreed with somebody who took one of these very extreme feminist views, you had to be hated. You became a non-person. I mean, people snubbed me in the street. It was really quite ludicrous. Yeah. But I learned a lot from that experience, and it was very bracing. I'm always going around saying this, but it's very bracing to be hated. It's a wonderful thing, I think, that can happen to a writer, as long as they don't, put a fatwa on you. But it means that you... I remember when I was quite young, before I actually published anything, I read that Simone de Beauvoir had said, "I write to be loved." And I thought, oh yes, I do too. That's what I'm like. I want everyone to love me and think I'm fabulous. But then there's nothing like having your ass kicked around the block by 40,000 raging women mostly to make you sit up. I mean, really, I had to take account of what I was doing, and I realised, okay, from now on, I'm not writing to be loved. I'm not going to hold back in case somebody doesn't like it. I'm just going to go blasting straight ahead, and I've tried to stick to that in the subsequent years, and it seems to have worked.
But your honesty isn't the same as certainty.
No.
You're seldom certain in any of your books about what you think, even in The First Stone, which is portrayed as a book that's that has some certainty about how to feel about things, but actually my profound sense of it, reading it for the first time 25 years after it was published, was its profound sense of doubt. Doubt seems to be the engine of your work. Reasonable doubt, artistic doubt, self-doubt, ethical doubt.
Well, yes, the older I get, the less certain I feel about anything, really. And I like that. I like the fact that, in a sense, that things are up for grabs, and that you can really go hammer and tongs with people about what's true and what's real and what matters, instead of just laying down the law, which is such a bore. And why would you bother to write a book?
Well, so that's part of my question of the craft of this, is that most people would write around it or through it or over it, bulldoze over doubt. But you put it smack bang in the middle of your work. It's the thing that everything else radiates around. When did you realise that you could, or that you should be doing that doubt should be at the centre of what you're doing?
Well, probably when I started to write non-fiction. I mean, I used to think of myself as a novelist, I suppose, and I did write a couple of novels, but these questions don't present themselves so powerfully in fiction as they do in non-fiction, I think I could say. So I realised that, okay, for example, I've written a couple of books that are about trials, murder trials, and I never went along to a court thinking that I knew whether the accused person was guilty or not. I went along thinking, I wonder what sort of person this is. What sort of person would murder her boyfriend under certain circumstances? What sort of person would drive his children into a dam and let them drown? What is that person like? That's that's what draws me to it. And I think that question is also what differentiates this person from me, this person who has gone through that membrane that separates us from our most violent urges and the satisfying of those violent urges. I think that's actually why people love crime so much. I mean, crime on TV and crime in books and crime stories, true crime. I'm not interested in writing true crime, by the way, but that's a whole other story. But I think...
but you do love the magistrates.
Yeah, I love courts. Finding courts late in my life was a wonderful thing for me, just to walk into this place where I never even knew I was allowed to go, because like a lot of people, I thought you had to get permission to go to a court. Yes. And just courts are these places where wild passion and terrible deeds come up against the reason and the desire for rationality behaviour, which of course is pretty much unattainable. But I think the thrill to me of sitting in a court is watching this strange structure called law trying to deal with what's wild and mad about human beings. And I find that so extraordinary and so moving and wonderful that the only reason why I don't do that work anymore is because I started to get some hearing loss, of age. Most people get in their 70s, and I just couldn't hear anymore in the court, and it was so frustrating. I had to give it up.
Changes the nature of your engagement with
Yes, yeah. Because
how was that change? How has the deafness changed your nature of the engagement with the world?
Oh, well, I'm not really that deaf. I mean, I can hear quite. I've only just got a little bit of hearing loss. I did know what made me notice it was that if I was talking with someone and they put their hand over their mouth in a gesture of thinking or wipe their nose, I would be filled with insane rage, and I couldn't work out why it was making me so angry. And I realised eventually that it was because I was lip reading. I go around the world being able to, I can engage in conversations quite well. I've got hearing aids, but they don't really help in court, because in courts at places of terrible acoustics. They're famous for having an awful acoustic. So,
you write a lot about our institutions of power. You write about universities and you write about courts and police and community care. The more you've written about them and inhabited them, do you find our institutions to be irredeemable or vital, or a sort of mix of both?
I don't think they're irredeemable. I think they fail. They fail and fail and fail because we're human. But it did surprise me, for example, how the police officers that I've got to know in the time I've spent in courts, I was very surprised to find how much I liked them and respected them and got on with them, because I'm an old hippie and we hated and feared the police, and we went on demos and got bashed and everything, and I saw the other side of policing, and it moved me and impressed me greatly. And so I when I'm watching TV now and there's been a terrible car crash, I really I rushed towards the set to see if I recognise any of the cops. I got to know the guys who were in what was called major collision investigation, and I always like to see them at work. Poor guys. Does that answer your question?
It does. I think the pandemic has thrown into sharp relief the extent to which we rely on institutions and how little we've spoken about them in the decades before, and the sort of erosion of our faith in them, and now that's being pushed to the forefront. There's a kind of acute engagement with what government institutions can and should and must do. And I feel like they're questions and discussions we need to have more.
One thing that's struck me during these lockdowns is how the whole idea of what a citizen is has exercised me to some extent. I have a very strong feeling of being a citizen now in ways that, being a sort of an artist or somebody who fancies themselves as being rather sensitive and well educated and draw their skirts aside from certain things. I've completely lost that feeling, and I hope it won't come back. But I when I look at anti-vax demonstrations and people refusing to wear masks, I feel quite berserk, and I realise that I've probably got a rather authoritarian personality because I really become enraged when people won't behave in a citizenly manner, and I've noticed how moved I've been during the pandemics, seeing crowds behaving decently. I find that quite wonderful. Not just the ones who sang on the balconies, which of course, made me howl, but when I saw that with the woman who invented the AstraZeneca vaccine getting a standing ovation at Wimbledon, I cried like anything. I thought, how wonderful, look at all these grateful people. I find,
Has that surprised you?
Well, yeah, yes.
Your sort of inner compliance?
No, because I think, as I said before, I think I probably have got an authoritarian personality to some extent. I like order, and because I used to be a teacher, and you have certain character traits which enable you to control the classroom. I
was raised by two teachers. I'm very aware of the teacher voice.
Yes, yeah, the teacher look. Things like that, yeah.
There is nothing more terrifying. It's often said we live in a kind of crisis of certainty, that either we have far too much of it or far too little of it, but not a kind of middle ground. That idea that we either have ideas that we're rusted onto, sort of ironclad certainty, or no trust at all. Do you have a sense of what you feel like in your work anyway is a healthy amount of doubt going in to your engagement with people, your engagement with truth? When does sort of scepticism turn into cynicism,
Yes.
I guess?
Well, that's an interesting question. That reminds me of something. One of my grandsons, who's 17, we were talking the other day about dreams, and I said, have you had those dreams where I had to go? Those dreams where you know that the meaning of life is just within your grasp, and when you step forward to grasp it, you wake up and boom, it's gone. And my grandson said, perhaps that is the meaning of life, the cynicism of waking up. And I thought, gosh, well, actually he's a very philosophical boy and often says things that pull me up short. But
well, maybe I should email him my list of existential
questions. I think you should. You'd get answers. But but we then discussed the difference between cynicism and disillusionment, and that was an interesting discussion too. But I think that always when I'm dealing with strangers in my work, in non-fiction, I'm always going for the part of them that is not defended. I always want to get round their defence and find the part of them which they share with me. And that's making me think of something wonderful that Zadie Smith said in one of her essays. She talked about our griefs. Our griefs are what we share and what we can, that's the territory on which we can meet. And I was very struck by that observation. I think I learnt a lot in writing non-fiction. I learnt a lot about people's, and particularly men's, vulnerabilities and their fears. If you can get to what people are afraid of, that's often a place where you can meet another person.
In that soft sort of tenderness.
Yeah.
How do you get there?
Oh, it takes a while. I mean, you hang out with them. You spend time with them and you listen to them a lot. That's another thing I learnt about interviewing people, was how to shut up. I mean, that's the basic, one of the most fundamental skills in interviewing is the ability to ask a question, hear the first answer that comes, and then to sit quietly and wait while the other answers come to the surface of the person you're talking to or the person you're listening to. Just patience, I think.
Do you feel like you have sort of literary compatriots or contemporaries or sort of people you venerate that do that really well in their work?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is the American journalist Michael Lewis. Do you know his work? Yeah, I think he's marvellous. I greatly admire him. Janet Malcolm, of course, was the queen of this. Yeah.
Just getting out of everyone's way.
Yeah. But there's a lot, people will tell you a lot without even speaking. I mean, especially if you go to their house. But I always think that's almost cheating in a way, to go to someone's house. But I mean, I don't ever want a journalist to come to my house, because they'll look around and see all the things that I have forgotten are there, that are telling all the things about me. The last time I let a journalist come to interview me in my office, where I never let anyone go before, the thing that he saw, I looked around and I thought, oh, there's nothing here that gives me away. And he saw I had pinned onto the clipboard an envelope that said on the outside, "dead batteries." For some reason, when he went away with that detail, and I burst out laughing when I saw it. I thought, oh, I didn't notice that, and I don't know why it seemed to have some enormous meaning.
Some deep Freudian thing. That's gorgeous. You write in Joe Cinque's Consolation about how the story finds the writer, not the other way round. Is there a particular way that stories find you? Is it a state of mind that you're in? Are you searching for something you don't know you're searching for? That. Is it rage? Is it what captures a story in you? Like what gets its hooks in?
Well, I think it must be that you're in a certain frame of mind and you're just going about your business, walking around the world. And it's like a little sign, a little light that blinks, or just some sign pops out to you. And there must be 1,000 of those signs passing every day as you walk around a city, for example. Although I must say it's so long since I've done that I can't remember what it's like. But just some tiny remark that a person makes, or something that you see happen between two people in the street that sparks something in you. Something you see in a court. You see somebody on a witness stand, and you notice something about their body when they're speaking, and they seem to be speaking with complete confidence. But because you're sitting slightly behind them, you can see their bum muscles are flexing and flexing and flexing because they're so scared and so anxious. Their glutes, they're sort of bulging. Yeah.
That's a wonderful way of reading somebody.
Yeah, we just have to get behind them. It's not always easy to do.
Because it strikes me in a lot of your nonfiction, the story is so insistent, and often you're so reluctant. You don't want to write it, or you're done with it, or you're sick of it, and you sort of, the same in The First Stone. I'm done with this. I'm putting it away. I've had enough of this, and then it insistently returns. And it forces itself, in a sense, to be written.
Yes. Well, that's the sort of feeling that you get that, there are some stories where sometimes I'm sitting in a court and I think, I was born to do this. I was born to tell this story. And it's a feeling of the intense gratification and joy that comes over me sometimes. So I think the thing about court stories is that your intellect, your intellect and your emotions are fully engaged. Everything in you is rolling along the road, and everything's in gear with everything else. It's the most fantastic feeling, and I've mostly, I think, only ever had that feeling in a court.
Don't wish you were a lawyer?
Oh God, no, because then I'd have to think more. I mean, no, to be a lawyer, I haven't got a very, I'm not that good at reasoning, and also I'm too emotional to be a lawyer. I think I would find it hard to detach enough from the emotion of the story and the pain of the story. That's the other thing about courts that I was surprised to find, that they're always spoken of as places of reason, but they're actually a sea of emotion, of suffering and pain and anger and fear, and it's almost like a sort of gas when you walk into the room. And I find that
yes,
sometimes you walk in and you just have to sort of calm yourself in the face of that turmoil of feeling that there is.
That's quite an incredible way to think about it, and the law's a very blunt instrument up against that slippery grief.
And the complexity of people's behaviours. I mean, the things that people do that are so kind of finely calibrated, and the law has these clonking great categories that it has to cram everything into. Yes, it's really quite wonderful. Actually, the very first trial I ever went to, I had a strange experience in that court, which I've never forgotten. And it happened at the end. There were two people accused of having murdered a couple of teenagers. And I sat through the trial. I was there because one of the girls was the stepdaughter of a great friend of mine, and I went along to sort of keep my friend company because it was so traumatic. And at the when it came to what I didn't know what the rules were of how a murder trial was run at this point, and I didn't know there was such a thing as the judge's charge to the jury. I'd never heard of any of that. But the judge said, he told the jury, he said, you may not. There was a couple, a married couple had committed this murder, and he said, you may not. The evidence against the woman is not sufficient for you to find her guilty. He actually laid it out for them. And when he said that, it's really hard to describe this without sounding crazy, but I had a feeling that in the room there was this huge force. And it was almost like, this really sounds mad, but it was almost like an angelic figure with wings. I thought, what that is, it's the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is what I witnessed that day. It was present in the room, and I thought, they really do have to prove it. And I was thunderstruck by that. I just sat trembling in the seat. It hadn't occurred to me, it never occurred to me that someone would say, you cannot find this person guilty because the evidence is not enough. Because everyone in the court was thinking, like, crazy bitch, we know that she was involved in this murder, but she didn't pull the trigger, or whatever. I can't remember how it went now, but everybody in the court wanted her and her husband to be, to die for what they'd done to these two kids. But I thought that in the room there was the rage and grief of the people that were in the room was being controlled by this mighty force of the power of reason, and I've never got over it. It was almost like a sort of religious moment to me.
That's extraordinary. I have a law degree, that's my background, and I did one unit over one Easter to buy myself an extra semester off, and it was a unit about advanced evidence and proof. And all we had to do was take a murder proposition and map out every piece of evidence we would need to prove it. And you think, well, that's easy. You need, a guilty act and a guilty mind. That's all. And then for weeks, we sat down and proved every single thing you would need to show, every piece of evidence. And in the end, I ended up with this document with 600 or 700 different propositions, and each of those propositions was attached to a physical piece of evidence or a piece of expertise that you would need. And at the end of it, folding out this single document with all of its propositions laid out, and the complexity of it was, again, the first time I'd ever felt that I'd been sitting in classrooms for years, writing down the rules and learning, issue, rule, application, conclusion, and feeling like it was all desperately procedural. And then that document felt like unfolding that power you talk about, and realising that any one of those little things, if I'd pulled it out, was like this fabric. And if I'd pulled that out, the weave of it would have completely disappeared, how gossamer it all was. And that's the lesson when I think about law school. That's the lesson that sticks with me. It's the same force that you're talking about. And I remember it with the same ferocity of recognition in that moment, late at night, putting sticky dots down on a piece of paper.
Yeah, it is an astonishing thing. And to think that human beings judge each other, and it's just, to me, completely awesome and awe-inspiring and sort of wonderful.
One of the images that stuck with me for years now from your books is you're at an airport and a school acquaintance knocks, taps you on the shoulder and says, "Oh, Helen, it's you." And you remember him so vividly from an incident of punishment at school. I think he's having his mouth washed out with soap
for
publicly.
Swearing. Yeah.
And you remember it, and you've seen it, and you tell him about how this is a vivid sort of flashbulb memory for you. And he not only doesn't recall it, but doesn't believe that it happened to him. And that clash of your certainty and his rebuttal, when you're a non-fiction writer and you come across the unsolvable problem of memory, how do you trust? How do you move past that?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that seeing somebody on a witness stand, a flood of information pours out from a person who's being examined or cross-examined. There are some witnesses that you can... the other thing is, of course, in a court, you tend to look a lot at the jury and see what effect the witnesses, the testimony of the witnesses is having on the jury. You can see their suffering, the sort of torment that we're talking about. Which of these people do I believe? I've never been on a jury, have you?
No.
I've never.
I haven't.
Me
I've always
too.
wanted to. I've been desperate to.
Me too. But I've never even been called for some reason, which is a great, now.
Maybe they've read your
well,
books.
now I'm too old. They wouldn't. I think they'd probably think, oh, she's just an old duck. I wouldn't get a gig. but yes, I do. How you trust someone, why you trust someone and not someone else, is a great mystery to me. But so I guess the sort of, I don't know if this is an answer, but I think when I'm in court looking at a variety of witnesses and thinking which of them is telling the truth and which of them should I trust, I usually am sort of kind of prisming it through the jury to think, they're believing him. I think they're believing him. And then I have another look at him and I think, do I? And so, I mean, there's no firm answer to those questions, as you discovered with all your huge spreadsheet.
I guess I mean on the page. How do you grapple with it?
On the page? You mean writing the book?
Yeah.
Well, I guess, I don't know, this comes back to... I don't know how to answer that. I really don't know. And there is enormous. You take enormous risks in writing a book and making the sort of judgment that sort of seeps up out of what you're writing, even if you're trying not to fill it with judgment, I think.
Yeah.
I remember being very relieved when a guy, years after that book, The First Stone, came out, the one that got me into all the trouble, the one about the sexual harassment charge at a university residential college. I ran into a guy a few years later who had been working in the place, and he said, I read your book, he said, you got them all right. And by which he meant the people who were on the staff and the people who...
There has to be something to pin it with.
Well, you see, this comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, about it not being certain and wanting to invite the reader in. And that brings me to talk about why I always build myself into these books, these non-fiction books.
That was my next question.
Well, that's my only way of dealing with it, with this problem of not being certain and being, in fact, full of doubt. The only way I can deal with that is to sort of invite the reader in, but to put myself in there and say, well, it means, you're an unreliable narrator, or whatever the expression is. It means that, one day you think, oh yes, definitely this guy did it. He did it and he is guilty. And then the next day, and then next chapter, some other witnesses come forward and everything's thrown into doubt. So it's a matter of inviting the reader into the process of engagement with the story that you yourself as a writer are working your way through. And when I figured out that I could do that, rather than being a sort of an omniscient God narrator, which would go completely against the grain in me, there's no way that I could do that. But when I figured I could do that and basically be saying to the reader, look, have a look at this. See, this is what look he had on his face. And I thought this about it, but I'm not totally sure. So that puts on the writer the necessity to observe really, really finely, so that you've got very fine observations to present to the reader to allow them to make a judgment, if they want to make a judgment, rather than go swimming in the sea of doubt forever.
I'd much rather swim in the sea. But one of the things I wonder about is, and sort of bring up the diaries then as a process, for someone who is constantly self-interrogating and doing that not only in the non-fiction work, but doing that in their own diaries, if you're doing that, is it harder to turn your life into a narrative if you're constantly self-interrogating, or is it strangely easier to do that? When you sort of look back over the journals you've kept for years, do you see a narrative pull out, or the fact that you're constantly questioning why you're there and who you are and what you do, does it get in the way?
No, because it's actually awful going back over the diaries to see yourself walking off cliff after cliff, and that's the thing that you see if you go back over, say, 20 years of diary of yourself as an adult. You see the patterns in your behaviour repeating again and again and again in that Freudian sort of way. I mean, whatever it is that happens to you that creates that pattern. And you see yourself doing the same things over and over again and not having learnt. So that's the kind of narrative I saw, this kind of coiling narrative of, oh, what a wonderful guy, I adore him and he loves me too, and now let's live together, that kind of thing, and then boom, crash, and off the cliff you go. And I often thought, when I was going back over the diaries to sort of cut the crap out of them and make them into something publishable, there's Michael Leunig, the cartoonist, used to do these cartoons way back in the 70s of angels. He used to have these little angelic figures that were like little people with nighties flying through the air, and they had little wings, and they would be looking down onto the earth. They'd be airborne, and they'd be looking down onto the earth, and down on the earth is wars and violence and people murdering each other, and the angels, they'd fly with this look on their face of, horror and dismay. And the thing was that there's nothing they could do to help. They were just helpless witnesses of human awfulness and cruelty. And in a way, that's what it's like going back over your diaries. It's like being a witness who can't speak, can't call out a warning, can't engage with the action that's happening on the page, and watching the same patterns reproduce themselves again and again. It was actually quite a shocking experience and very painful. And I sort of don't... There are also moments where, the angelic witness, being myself, would burst out laughing. I mean, it was just so grotesque, some of the things that I wrote down and that I found again in my own record of my own life.
I think that's so generous about the diaries is that you share them with us, that you don't create some... You could create some Uber writer, some wonderful self-assured woman who skips. But you don't. You rip up a lover's cigars and boil them in a pot of borscht, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
And we weep for joy with you.
Yeah, well, actually, when I published the first diary, naturally, they're horribly revealing, but I thought, oh God, I'm the worst person in the world. I'm the meanest person and the laziest person. I thought I've shown all my crimes and the most unlovable person and the person so incapable of love. And, I sort of beat myself up for hours along this boring way. But when the first one came out, I was really amazed at how many people got in touch with me and said, that could have been me. It could have been me. That's just what my marriage was like. And thank you so much for writing this. And I thought, oh, I'm not such a monster after all. And I found a wonderful sense of camaraderie or of comradeship with the whole human race. I thought, it's not just me. Everybody's cruel and mean and lazy and sometimes funny. And and so it was terribly heartening to me. I thought, well, it is worth the sort of trauma and the labour of pulling it together and filleting
I
it.
think you have that wonderful line in the first diary, which is, I'm the only person who's carrying around a catalogue of my own crimes.
Everyone else is worrying about their own crimes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well...
What struck me, having read... I've been very lucky enough to have been able to read the third one, even though it's not out yet. And the three of them together read with the sort of the tension of a novel. And at the end of the first volume, your first volume self, so self in your 40s, says, they're on the cusp of an affair. That affair will become a marriage. That marriage will become a cage. But the woman in the first diary doesn't know any of that. And she writes, I feel very small, slight and impermanent. It is not too late for me to save myself. And reading that with hindsight, it's shockingly foreshadowing. And were you struck by how much your past self, in a sense, their doubts became sort of what happened? Their doubts became oracular, in a sense?
Exactly. I was really quite shocked by that. There were 100 moments in the diary, as the three volumes as they went along, where I thought, oh, why didn't I leave then? Why didn't I? I had that absolutely clear moment where I thought, this is going to end in trouble, or this is going to be a bleak life if I go ahead with this. But then I just thought, no, but I'm in love, and the craziness of the power of being in love is something that I was quite thunderstruck by, actually, when I went back and looked at it. I mean, there are all sorts of small moments, like where I thought, God, there's a moment where I get home from the supermarket and I say, oh, the woman who was on the checkout woman looked just like Dolly Parton. And my husband, or the guy I was with, my partner at the time, said, who's Dolly Parton? And when I looked looked back at that and I thought, now there's an exit right there, and I walked past it. But there are just moments like that when you look back at your life, that you do, if you weren't madly in love with that sort of blur of joy and hope in your head, you would have thought, oh no, wait a minute, this isn't going to work. This can't work. I mean, if this is a guy who's never heard of Dolly Parton, I can probably build a whole set of meanings into that fact, and this is telling me that that really perhaps this isn't such a good idea after all. And because it turned out to not be a good idea for reasons which I could trace back to the Dolly Parton ignorance moment.
I think that's a general red flag for anybody. You self-castigate a lot in your diary at the time, and that's very revealing for someone who's aspires to be an art maker and wants to put things on the page that matter, to read someone you admire throughout producing quite incredible work doing exactly the same thing, and to just choose a passage at random. I'm worried about art, what it's for, whether what I do is of any use to anyone, whether I've been killing myself all these years that I'm any good at it, that I've got anything at all to offer the human race, whether I should just chuck it in and look for a job. And it's lovely and no bullshit, but I wonder whether or not, has your self-doubt changed shape? Does it have its own narrative over time? Has it matured, or is it the same kind of cloying severity of the inner critic? Does it never go away?
No, it never goes away. Sorry to tell you, it never goes away. Well, in my case, it doesn't go away. But you know, as the years have gone by, I've actually thought that maybe to have a rather low opinion of yourself is a useful thing. I mean, I don't know if this is true about everybody, but every time I sit down to write something, even if it's like 3 paragraphs that I've promised to a magazine, I think I go through the same grinding process. I think, yeah, sure, I can do that. I'll hand it in 3 weeks. And then for the next 3 weeks, I'm just in a state of torment. I'm thinking, I've got nothing to say. I don't know how to write. Okay, I've written all those books. So what? I don't know how to write this particular thing. I have no idea how to do it. I'm going to have to ring them up and say I can't do it. And I go through this every time. And it took me a long time, probably partly having been in psychoanalytic psychotherapy sort of helped a bit because of that, what it teaches you about, you know, that sort of rolling repetition of life. But it took me a while to realise that this is actually part of the creative process. It's not just useless self-hatred. It's really something that allows your unconscious to do the work. And if you sit down and say, well, I've got to hand this in 3 weeks, I'll write it now and get it out of the way, there's nothing there. You can't think of anything to say. But your mind, your unconscious has to trawl through. It has to go through some sort of process, and you can't hurry it. And that's why deadlines are so essential, because you can get lost.
Yes.
Because you can get lost in that waiting. Waiting is terrifying. Waiting for the thing to sort of crystallise in your mind, and you think, oh, wait a minute, yeah, here's a sentence, and you write down one sentence, and you think, oh yeah, now that leads to another sentence, and then just this little chain of sentences, and suddenly there's your thing, what you were trying to write. But that terrible, I can't do this, I'm hopeless, I've never been any good, everyone's been lying to me for years, my work is always shit. Knowing this doesn't help. It doesn't shorten the process, and it doesn't lighten the burden of the process, but you just... something tells you, you know, that you do know that you might get out the other end of it if you just keep going. And that you mentioned earlier that there's doubt built into all my books, and, you know, bits where I say, oh, I can't go on, this is too awful. But once I forget who it was who said this, some poet said the only way out is through. And I've always thought it was Robert Frost, I think, who said that. And you get far enough into a book and you can't put it down because it's part of you. You know, your sort of guts are in it. You can't throw it away. You've just got to keep going. You have no choice. I mean, if you put it down and walked away, I don't know what would happen. But at a certain point, you've got so far in that the only way out is to keep going.
Did it feel like that about the diaries too?
Yeah.
Yeah. I hear you talked about psychoanalysis, and I wanted to bring that up because dreams are such a huge part of the diaries. These intricate, symbol-filled, wrenching, and then quite beautiful dreams. Are they something you draw on for your writing, or is it... They seem to be such an important part of the way you think about being in the world.
Well, the thing about writing about dreams is... I can't remember when I started writing about them. They always interested me, and I have quite vivid dreams. And I found that if I tried to write them down, it was a really good writing practice, because they're really hard to do. It's hard to get their mood and tone and their strange swerves, and the sorts of sometimes blissful emotions that stream through them. And that leads me to say that writing a diary to me is daily practice. And that's I do it now just because it's such a deep habit. I wouldn't know how to stop or want to stop. But the thing about when I went back, and when my publisher said, "Oh, why don't you go back and look at your diaries?" I thought, "Oh no, there's all that whinging crap that I don't want to look at." And when I went back there, I thought, "Oh, these are actually quite good." I mean, that surprised me. I thought I was trying to write well in the diary. I mean, I wasn't just slapping down, "Went to supermarket, so and so snubbed me," you know, that sort of bullshit. But just to write proper sentences and to work at imagery, like finding images for what had happened, and just practicing. I mean, that's my 10,000 hours, as they say.
There's a precision in the way they're captured, which really struck me.
The dreams, you mean? Or the diaries?
Yes, but also in everything that you notice, I think. The diaries have a particular precision to them. And I think that's sort of gels with what it is that you've just described, this idea of working it, the clarity of it, of trying to pin an experience or something that you've noticed or something you care about down to its essence. I think that's really clear. There's a line in one of the diaries where you're alone in a restaurant, people watching, and you say, "I wondered whether my loneliness made me want to take notes, or vice versa. How is a writer made?" How would you answer that question now? How is a writer made?
Well, maybe writers are quite lonely people. Isn't that, I think it's Joan Didion who says somewhere that writers are lonely, anxious rearrangers of things. And when I first saw that, I thought, "Oh God, that sounds like me." I think I look back and I see that in my family I was slightly to one side, as it were. I was the eldest of 6 kids, and I seem, when I look back at my childhood too, I was always trying to get away from the chaos of everything, and sitting in a restaurant by yourself, which I quite cheerfully do, and I know there are some women who don't like to go to places by themselves, women in my generation anyway. I think it's probably changed with youth, but having a notebook in your bag is, if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable in a public place, you can pull out a notebook and gives you a feeling of power. There's a certain power involved in writing things down, I find. But I don't know which comes first, but what makes a writer. So
where does life stop and a story start?
Well, they don't stop. They just sort of, doesn't one just kind of morph into another?
Slip into another.
Or just, what's the word for it? The text changes and suddenly you're in a book.
That's what it felt like reading the diaries, and I was so struck by the scene building inside of them. Even though they're fragments. They build to these quite incredible scenes, to denouements, to confrontations.
Well, because the thing about putting your diary together to publish it, it's really what it is. It's an editing job. It's a lot of cutting and a lot of sort of filleting and getting rid of acres of crap, of self-indulgent things, and also seeing the repetitions of things that come in a life. So sometimes I'd find I'd said something in exactly the same words 25 years ago. That was a strange experience. The whole thing of the diaries has been a very peculiar experience to me, and I'm glad I did it, but I'm stopping now. 3's enough, I figure.
How do you feel about the woman you read in those diaries now? Are you angry at her or forgiving, or does she feel alien to you?
No, she never feels alien. She feels like, I mean, I really don't think I've changed all that much. Well,
maybe that's excellent, to be totally, reassured of your own sensibilities.
No, it was just, I recognise that woman every day, and I feel I sometimes I just wanted to shout at her, or I wanted to shake her and say, wake up, can't you see what's happening, can't you see what you're doing? The blindness that you have. I mean, I've obviously got it now, and if I'm living blindly now, as everyone lives blindly to some extent, you're just kind of staggering through the days. But
well, that certainly feels true now.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Now that we've lost our sense of time, time is all spongy and weird because of the pandemic. Is that what you meant? It is. Because of the pandemic?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And that sense of waiting.
Yeah. But you don't even know what you're waiting for. No.
Waiting for.
It's bad. Maybe this is hell.
Well, you're excellent company.
You too.
I think we're reaching the end of our time, and I have one more question. For a writer who has engaged so humanely and sensitively and boldly and brashly with doubt, what are you certain about? What do you know for sure?
What am I certain about? I'm certain about my chickens. If I get up in the morning, I let the chickens out, and at night I put them away. That's been a great saviour for me in the pandemic. I know it seems probably a bit strange, but I mean...
No, I adopted rats. Rats.
What do you mean, they get on you? Do they get on you?
They do. They sit in my cleavage.
Get out! Did you make that up?
No, they do. They sit right between my D cups and have a bit of a look around.
Boy, that is really gross. I think that my chickens have saved me from losing the sense of. I mean, if the chickens weren't there to be dealt with, I would have stopped noticing a dawn and dusk. I think the shape of the day is because some creature depends on me for its life. That's what makes. There's no doubt in that. I also thought of. I actually do like people a lot, and I feel. I feel I particularly like children, and there's some freshness. There's some freshness that's there in humans all the time, if you can find it, grown-ups and children. There's some lovely tenderness in people, and I feel strongly about that, and I trust it, and I'm always looking for it.
That's wonderful. And on the page?
Yeah, there too. Everyone else's page.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us today,
Thanks,
Helen.
Beejay.
It's been so magical to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Like flowers cultivate in cracks in the concrete, culture grows in the spaces between the everyday.
It's there in darkened rooms when the stage lights come on. It's in a park full of people belting out the same song. It happens in classrooms, having a go, hands-on. It's found in small circles, exchanging stories. It's under a tent, making brand new discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognisable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
You also say in the book that when I see words, they frighten me. I instantly tense up. So this is a potentially daunting situation for you, is it, to be here at a literary festival?
Lots of people are always surprised to hear that I am dyslexic, doing live telly and autocue and emails and things like that. But actually, as it feels so relaxed here and so lovely, and this whole process of doing this book has I'll be honest, it's really helped me.
We didn't do much to alter the course of human history, did we? As one old spy to another, I reckon that had been more use running a boys' club.
His evocative and brilliant books, and I'm quoting there from the current head of MI6, have come to define not only the best of spy fiction, but also the tenor and texture of our times, loved around the world by critics and audiences alike. Le Carré's work has been published in 50 countries and over 40 languages.
I thought I was writing this soft and fluffy thing, and I've written this, when I reread it for the edits, I said I've written this dark, twisty book with rage on the page.
The depth of the characters is, in a good spy novel, that's what you're really looking for.
When I started GCHQ, the main target was analysing the armed forces and the order of battle of the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. Now it's actually about the defence of us in this hall.
Our democracy in our country is gold standard. I am not willing, nor will I ever be willing, to not be amongst the people who I represent. It is not an option. It is not one that would allow me to do my job. They could give me every risk assessment in the world. I have to not let terror terrorise me.
I often ask people what they read during lockdown and if they read, and what was it that got to them, what was it that helped them, or what was it that distracted them. Because I think we wanted a bit of solace, didn't we? We wanted a bit of escapism and we wanted distraction. And I think also there's a kind of sense of comfort. I think that's what I was seeking, certainly in something familiar.
We are, of course, in the company of two extraordinary women. They didn't just fight for king and country in khaki, but of course they have just survived a second national crisis while reminiscing on the first. And I tell you what, if you found isolating tough, try being in your late 90s without much technology. It was a feat, wasn't it, getting you on Zoom, Betty?
Absolutely, yes.
But we got there in the end.
Nearly took off.